Medications play an important role in the treatment of many mental health problems. We'll talk about their helpfulness and their limitations next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. When it comes to the treatment of mental health problems and mental illness, there are all kinds of questions, probably because there are all kinds of treatments which could be helpful. And that's a good thing, but it often leads to a lot of questions then. Some of the most commonly asked questions are about the use of medications to treat mental health problems, which is why we devote an entire episode to answering your questions about medication and mental illness. Now, because there's usually a lot of people calling in, and you should be calling in, I vote that you start calling in your questions now so we'll have time to actually get to them. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Now to the guests. It's the Dr. Steve Show. Makes it easy for all of us. Our first Dr. Steve is Dr. Steve Bauer, the medical director at the Human Development Center. He's board certified in child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry. And our second Dr. Steve Sutherland, is the chair of psychiatry at Essentia Health and the medical director of Amberwing Center for Youth and Family Wellbeing. He's also board certified in child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry. Thanks to both the Dr. Steves for coming in tonight. So we're going to talk about some general questions about medications and mental illness, and then also some specific topics. I think we're going to actually start a little maybe with a couple of specific topics here. So talk about, and I'll go to you first, Dr. Bauer. Bipolar disorder is one of the mental illnesses where we typically think that that is a disorder which often requires medication. And talk to us a little bit both about why that is the case as opposed to maybe other disorders like anxiety where you don't necessarily need medication and how medications work.
Great. So bipolar certainly is one of what we consider to be the more serious and persistent mental health problems. And there are a variety of versions, but certainly when folks have episodes of mania and major depression, then it's unlikely that managing that off medications won't disrupt their life. And so by that I mean typically folks, particularly when they're manic, but also when depressed, will have such severe symptoms that they lose jobs, they lose relationships, they quite often lose housing or other things. And so at least in the onset, as they're starting to recover, we think that finding medication that they can tolerate that's helpful for them is very necessary, right? So the medications, there's a variety of them. The original medicine, lithium, was a medicine that still has many not quite well understood reasons that it works. And then there's a variety of medicines that are newer, that are proven, and a group of those are anticonvulsants that are one of the mechanisms that's proposed is the kindling or difference in how people's electrical activity works. And by calming that, we think there is less amplitude of the highs and lows when they take those medicines. Certainly other mood regulating medicines, which the controversy is whether or not to take antidepressants, but atypical antipsychotics that work both on mood and by calming more strongly are other medicines that have been used extensively with folks with this. And for many people, they've been very much a part of their recovery.
Yeah, well said. If I can add one thing in there too.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes understanding the medication treatment for bipolar disorder is easier to use the old-fashioned term that was used until about 20 years ago when they changed the name from manic depression to bipolar disorder. Because what you're really trying to do is prevent mania. When you have a person who has depression, we have options for treatment. Psychotherapy works usually to treat depression. On the other hand, in the state of mania, which is this persistent sort of high adrenaline state from which the body cannot de-escalate on its own, and it just changes the person's capacity to be themselves, act like themselves, is not responsive to psychotherapy. And so you really need to do something to slow that train down. So sometimes that's easier to understand, I think, by using the old-fashioned manic depression term.
I think that's a really great point. And talk a little bit, Dr. Sutherland, just about how easy or not easy it is to convince somebody who's maybe newly diagnosed with bipolar disorder or manic depression that you really do need the medication.
I think most of the time when somebody is suffering enough, and when they look around and they hear people that care about them and they care about sort of saying you need to get some help, most people are responsive to that. There's a unique feature of not all cases in which there is mania, but many in which the person has a sense of, sometimes the word is grandiose that's used, or sort of an invincible feeling that, and it's can be, at least in the early stages before it becomes destructive, it can be a very productive state where the person just feels great and they're accomplishing all kinds of things, and why would I want to slow that train down? And that in that scenario can be extremely difficult to convince the person, why would I want to give that up? So that can be an obstacle.
And I think for a lot of people, that sense that they're wanting to be in control and that the medicines are going to somehow change the fact that they still need to do things to help themselves control that, becomes confused as an either-or situation. And when they can kind of get the idea that this is really part of helping them do what they need to do, then I think a lot of people are more amenable to it. But there is certainly a lot of folks that kind of go back and forth, and going on and off medicine really tends to make the highs and lows worse.
I wanted to talk about that next, because once they start feeling a little better, then how hard is it to get people, especially maybe, I would say, what I see in my practice is maybe newly diagnosed, but also younger, and trying to get them to understand that this is a chronic illness. So now they're starting to feel better and almost treat it like an antibiotic, even though one of you would have said, no, this is medication to stay on. And it's like, well, I'm better now, I don't need the medication.
Yeah, that's a frequent occurrence, and I think it takes some trial and error with some folks before they're able to get how much that does affect. And it's different for each person somewhat, because the episodes of mania and depression can be spread out by quite a period of better functioning. And so sometimes they go off medicine and they don't become immediately worse, and that adds to the confusion, right? So
the in the situation where we often also see people with mania, and where that's what's driving them maybe into the emergency room or into the hospital, that's maybe how they're getting that first diagnosis. And a lot of people in the really acute and sort of virulent phase of the mania then don't have good memory for what that was like. Talk a little bit just even about how that must, to my mind, that would make it harder to convince me to stay on the medication as well.
Sure, yes. I think all one needs to do is look at the way that mood process and thought process and speech process happens. If you happen to be sitting talking to a person who's in a state of mania, they will describe that their mind may be moving 1,000 miles an hour, and their mouth is doing all it can to try to keep up at 700 miles an hour, but it can't ever keep up. And so when a person's in that state where emotion and thought and speech are so mismatched and everything is moving too rapidly, you simply can't. It would be like, I suppose, trying to pick something off the road when you're going at highway speeds. There's no way there's no way to pick up the specific memories, or to think, I've been down this road before. This is a dead end. I think I better take some medicine and calm this thing down. There just isn't. It's no fault of that person. They're not in a state of their brain which can allow for insight.
A lot of people as well complain about side effects for some of these medications, and talk a little bit about that. So now you have maybe somebody who is newly diagnosed with already having maybe difficulty understanding this, that how can I be this age and have a chronic illness? You know, we often, I just think in our society in general, we think of chronic illnesses as hitting the elderly, not the young, even though many physical illnesses can be chronic at a young age. But now we've got side effects on top of it, or people complaining about the side effects. And how does that complicate things, and what do you do to help people to kind of work through that?
Yeah, and I think that the progress that we've made has a lot to do with having more options. And certainly anytime we have a more serious mental health problem, we wind up giving medicines that are stronger. And stronger medicines have more potential for side effects. There are people that take them that get no side effects, but quite often there are some, if not several, and when you read the package insert, there are lots, right? And not many of us think, oh, that would be wonderful if I got all those things. And so trying to work with folks to first try it and see what they're experiencing, and then see, A, is it working, and then B, what are the side effects, and trying to work within the different categories that we have at our disposal, and incorporating the things that they need to do to really help with that. And you know, things like sleeping and eating healthy and exercising are always very much helpful, but quite often not enough on their own.
Yeah, and then which side effects it is that really drives people away from taking the medications really depends on the illness and depends on the type of medication being used. So the more seriously, say, disabling the illness is at that particular time, the more likely there are to be higher doses of medications that might have side effects ranging from the person perceiving that they have a hard time getting rid of that morning drowsiness to at times having some side effects which could include some mild shakiness or feeling of muscle stiffness, or that their movements are a little slowed. That's pretty disconcerting for a person who's used to sort of operating at their own usual speed. Whereas most people, when faced with some of the standard dosing for, say, an episode of anxiety or depression, will be able to work through the nuisance phase of side effects, which tends to only last 3, 4, 5, 6 days, in which perhaps they get some stomach upset. And people can be coached to say, hey, you might notice this for the next week, but be patient because your body will probably accommodate.
Here's a question, in fact, from a woman who says, can any medication for mental health problems cause hallucinations?
So certainly in different individuals, the way we metabolize medicine is not always the same for everybody. And so most medications that we prescribe are not known to do that themselves, and yet under certain circumstances it's another stress to the body, and I've had patients report that.
There are some, and sometimes we look at the mechanism of action of these meds. So for instance, there are some medications used to treat attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, which work through the neurotransmitter dopamine, which also happens to be a neurotransmitter that when some of the medications for the illnesses that have hallucinations, so schizophrenia being an illness, for instance, which has hallucinations, part of the usual mechanism that the meds work is through helping to block the excessive dopamine that happens in the gatekeeping areas, sort of in the central brain where emotions and thoughts tend to be filtered. And so blocking some of that static through blocking some of the excessive dopamine circuits, that's part of the way medicine's work. And so if you give a medicine for, say, again, like ADHD, for instance, that actually sometimes helps to stimulate part of the dopamine system in a different region of the brain, there can be some sort of leakage, if you will, or a crossover effect on that part of the brain, and you can actually get kind of that opposite effect. So sometimes we look, by looking at the mechanism, you can sort of predict what some of the more odd side effects might be.
Here's a woman, Dr. Bauer from Beaver Bay, with bipolar disorder, who's prescribed Inderal to reduce the shakiness, as she said, but is not tolerating that well and wonders if there's any other options for her.
Well, so
talk to her doctor is always the number one option.
Exactly. So whoever she's working with would be the first person to talk to. But Inderal is one of the beta blocker medicines that's really used for blood pressure, but is probably the most effective way to reduce tremor. There are several others that are milder that could be tried. Medicines that are side effects for a lot of those medicines, something like Artane or Benadryl or Cogentin are all the other options to some degree. Dr. Sutherland, other thoughts?
Oh, you covered the main other alternatives to that, yeah.
Yeah, and the big thing is talk to your doctor then
Yep.
about the fact that I'm not doing well on this. What other alternatives are there for me?
Absolutely.
So kind of continuing on our theme of when we're having difficulty convincing people to be on medications, one of the things, I hear about a lot in my office and that we hear it in the office is often parents of adult children who are concerned because their adult child has been diagnosed with a mental illness, maybe sometimes for years, is not staying on medication, doesn't think that they need to be on medication. The family member watches their mentally ill family member get worse, and the phone call to my office is, isn't there some way we can make them be on medication? Dr. Sutherland.
Right. The making somebody be on medication is reserved for a relatively small number of people who meet a certain legal standard of what's called court commitment, sometimes with orders to get treatment, and that typically involves situations where the illness is both severe and there's significant dangerousness involved. So typically it's more about trying to help coax, maybe is sometimes the word, or sometimes it's through helping them rejoin a really important role to them. So oftentimes where the successes come in is if that family can get them back connected with friends or a part-time job or some other area where their loved one starts to experience the way that life sort of can be when it's at its best again, and then from that lens they can often see what impact the symptoms are having more. But as long as they are essentially housebound, it's extremely difficult to talk somebody into rejoining treatment.
One of the things that I've appreciated, because I know both of you and I know how both of you work also, is that working with your patients of saying, here's what your options are. But I really think that forcing doesn't work. It makes people stay away from treatment, is what it does, and turns them off to coming in to help. And I know that both of you have this, and both of you, I think, advocate that in both of the centers where you work, is that to the extent that you can have this sort of open door, and I'll work with you even if they're not willing, we believe that someday down the road that they will be willing. And that's not always, I know that parents and other family members, that still makes them nervous, but because it's a slower road than sometimes what family members want.
Much slower for a lot of people, and it's unfortunate, but we all learn at our own speed. And I think the piece of when we get to the point where they've been in danger, other people have been in danger, and we start working with them, sometimes when someone's on medicine and they're able to think more clearly, they can then find that and move forward from there. But quite often you can make things more complicated by trying to force them into treatment.
Is there, one of the kind of, it feels sort of newish, I see more and more patients having done this, the genetic testing. And talk a little bit about sort of what role does genetic testing play in helping you to see which medications might be more effective, and at what point would you say to a patient like this is a good idea for you to do?
Well, this is a question that I think will probably be a lot more exciting 10 years from now.
Okay.
Right now, the role is...
Okay, hang on, 10 years.
The role
Dr. Sutherland's coming back with Dr. Bauer.
The role at this point is pretty limited. It basically can describe for you and your doctor, your healthcare team, whether you're likely to be a rapid metabolizer, a medium metabolizer, or a slow metabolizer of the medicines, and therefore predict how likely is it for you to easily get to a therapeutic level. We're not that far removed from the era of trial and error, and so the number of cases where that's actually a useful bit of information are pretty limited at this point. But genomics is a rapidly expanding field in all areas of medicine, from oncology to cardiology to psychiatry. I expect we will be in a different place 10 years from now.
I would agree that there are limited uses currently, and it's mainly in the metabolism or the liver's ability to manage the medicines that we're using to a large degree. I think we have a consultant from the university who's been analyzing more of these, and is finding some folks do have some unique patterns, and I think the main thing is if you don't tolerate medicines a lot, you're finding treatment is held up by that, then getting genetic testing can help us understand if it is because of this reason, and if it's not, then we have more information about what to do.
That's an answer too.
Yep.
And with what you just said, it would seem to me like if I was a person who was having, it's okay, you've tried me on 4 different medications and that hasn't gone well, and then maybe you suggest this testing, I might be more willing to try the 5th one if I felt like we had maybe a different roadmap that we were going on.
Yep. I think that's certainly true in some situations, but every person is an individual as to what they'll tolerate or willing to try. And I do think Dr. Sutherland's comment that we're still not very far removed from trial and error. And the good part is you can predictably kind of look at what people tell you about what side effects they've experienced and try to use different mechanisms or think about medicines in different categories. And then if you keep getting the same kinds of results, then maybe looking at this genomics.
Here's a question. A man called in severely depressed and had a spiritual awakening and now doesn't need to take medications. And then he asks, is that accurate? Like, can there be people who have severe depression and have a spiritual awakening and now don't need medication?
Well, I assume that if he says it's accurate, it's accurate. What we know is that spirituality, whether in the form of prayer or meditation, having an active spiritual life where one allows oneself the space to be open to those experiences, to wonder, to look around for comparisons of where they fit in the world. That's an extremely healthy trait for anybody that's been going through depression or anxiety. And whether it's impossible, of course, to point in any given individual how much was the spiritual practice a part of the apparent cure or the remission of the episode or whatever you want to call it, versus how much was it that plus other factors. It's impossible to say in retrospect, but you better believe it. Spirituality can be an important part of the emergence from a severe episode of depression.
Excellent, thank you. How does prescribing change as somebody becomes more elderly, or does it change at all? Because I know the answer is yes for physical health medicine. It's hard for me to believe it's not going to be yes for psychiatric medicine.
You are correct, Dr. Phelps. Yes is the broad answer. Specifically, the older we get, the harder it is for our body to metabolize medicines and other pharmacokinetic, we call it, how our body holds and moves medicine changes as our body changes with age. And so generally speaking, lower doses with milder things and looking at age-specific recommendations.
Another aspect of that question too is that as people get older and have the chance to get illnesses that happen in people as they get older, ranging from heart attacks to emerging after a bout of cancer or whatever those might be. There have been a number of studies which suggest that anybody, once they've been through treatment for an intense condition like that, or heart failure would be another example, their prognosis, even for their heart condition, is improved if they take an antidepressant medication. So you get, in younger people, it would be less likely to say, oh, this is a person who's at risk for potentially emerging with a depressive episode. In people as they get into their 50s, 60s, 70s, and are more likely to get some of these conditions, we have research evidence that suggests that we can actually mitigate some of the risks from their own primary health condition by treating what's essentially at the time a more hypothetical depression. So interesting, as the decades go on, there are some other applications.
Excellent. We have time for one more question, Dr. Bauer. And so with all of this, what would you say is the sort of one message you want to get out to our viewing audience then?
Well, I think there are a lot of things out there about medicines, but certainly medicine done right is one of your messages of hope, I think, and I'd like to share that certainly my experience of doing this for 20 plus years has been that I've seen a lot of people who find medicines a vital part of their recovery and can be very helpful without life-threatening kinds of complications to other significant things that they need to deal with, but certainly part of making life for folks that have these kinds of illnesses much better.
Thank you very much, and thanks to both of you for coming here tonight, and thank you for joining our conversation and calling in those questions. So really, also part of the take-home message is that if you have a family member, be patient with them, even if they're not operating on your timeline. And if you yourself are having difficulty on your mental health medications, then talk with your healthcare professional. If you feel like you can't talk with your healthcare professional, find one that you can talk to. Don't forget to join us. Well, actually, you're not going to join us in the next 2 weeks because we're going to be taking a break. But you can visit us at the web on speakyourmindonline.org. We're going to be taking a 2-week break for the holiday. I am driving the teleprompter guy nuts because I'm going all over the place here. And so we're taking a 2-week break for the holidays, and I hope that you will take this time to relax and recharge for the benefit of, that would be, your own mental health. Join us again in the new year on Thursday, January 4th, 2018, when we'll be talking about running for your life, exercise, and mental health. After you see this show, you're going to want to write exercise on your 2018 list of things to do, so you might as well go ahead and get it over with and just write it on there right now. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.